How many of you grew up in a place where you could run in the middle of the street and play? Lucky you. I think most of my work, or at least the work that I'm going to talk about today, has to do with feeling powerful and creative in the environment in which you're raised and in which you live. So I've been working pretty much for the past 10 years in one square block in one neighborhood, 48223 in Detroit. And sometimes you can run in the block in the middle of the street because there's no traffic. But then you might want to ask why there's no traffic in what used to be one of the largest cities in the United States. This is where I grew up. It's the block that I grew up on. It's the block that both my mother and father grew up on. They were 18 years apart, so they didn't know each other growing up. My father described the city when I was growing up as like a gap-toothed smile, that there were vacant lots and buildings. And the buildings were the teeth, and the vacant lots were the gaps. And there were more gaps at that point than teeth. It's still the building that my mom lives in, and the neighborhood has changed around us. And it is also usefully the neighborhood where my hair grew up as a sort of wonderful, buoyant force. I didn't know that you could cut it, and my mother liked it, I think. But it was something that caused people on the street to yell unwanted things to me, like Ronald's in the house, or Lucille Ball, or just yo, big head. And in most instances, I understood that I had a street presence and a public life that I didn't care for, and I had no control over. So I felt vulnerable in that environment, and I wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. And I used education as my way to get out of that environment. So I think of the work that I do with young people in Detroit, and I'd say that's roughly 8 to 24 years old, as understanding the relationship between an individual and the built environment. And the capacity to have some agency to affect that has a great relationship between whether you choose to leave or choose to stay. So imagine that street where you grew up on, where you could run and play. I'm curious how many of you can either afford to live there or would like to live there, and how many of you think of it fondly. I think most of the young people I work with, the brightest and the most creative, can't wait to get out of there in very similar ways to the way that I felt. So I teach a course called Change by Design, and we have an alum of that course here, that works with that understanding that we can equip young people with some degree of creative confidence, not so that they become woodworkers or welders or screen printers or gardeners or solar light designers, and we do end up touching on all those things, but so that they can have the creative confidence to design their environment in a way in which they can see themselves reflected or they can shape it. So we have the Brightmoor Makerspace, which will have its grand to the public opening on May 2nd. And we have at the Makerspace one thing that I'm a big fan of, which is a women's only or girls only woodshop day. So you can get the boys out of the way who tend to be loudmouths. And when you work with a 12 to 15-year-old who had never used a power tool before, at the end of the day, who can teach someone else to do it, you've created some sense that there is power and agency in learning how to use tools to build things. We do a ton of bike work. So we have at our disposal 150 industrial tricycles that were bequested to us by a Ford plant outside of Cleveland that used to use the trikes to go up and down the factory floors. But as operations shrunk, they no longer needed the trikes, and we got them. We rebuild them, we weld them, and we turn them into things that are useful for getting around the neighborhood, whether this one, which is for a grocery delivery. We recently built a taco trike, a mobile flower business, a kombucha vehicle, and a refrigerated vehicle that is operated by someone who has a gelato and sorbet business. And all of those have some revenue stream attached to them, but perhaps the most significant in some ways, the sort of conjectural vehicle that actually functions, is this water purification cycle that we built. It took us 6 months to build the first one, and 8 days to build the second one. It's capable of attaching to your rain barrel as it collects roof runoff, and we can create 30 gallons of potable water in 15 minutes. This is all designed and built by students. So I'm going to go back in my last minute to that street that you saw those kids running down. Our buses come in and out. I work with a K through 12 school. Our buses come in and out on a street that used to look like this, and there's a nicely placed fire plug. So if you're running on the sidewalk, you have a nasty surprise. But along with my colleague Roland Graff and our collaborator Michael Flynn, we were able to secure enough funding to transform that sidewalk from sort of an eyesore where kids waited for the bus into something sort of spectacular by moving the fire plug, by repairing the sidewalk, and striping it for a 40-yard dash with a pedestrian speed display so you can clock your distance and see how fast you're going. It has the unintended consequence of cars thinking it's for them, so they slow down a little bit. But if at the end of the day you can feel like this, it's pretty great. Thank you all.